There was a particular kind of silence that lived in the hours before dawn on Sunday mornings. Not the absence of sound, but a different quality to it, as if the air itself was waiting. The house would be dark except for the kitchen, where a single bulb hung over the stove and cast long shadows across linoleum that had been mopped the night before. Grandmother would already be awake, moving through that space with the practiced economy of someone who had done this for 50 years. The smell of hair grease heating on the burner mixed with the coffee percolating in the aluminum pot, and that combination meant Sunday was coming, whether you were ready or not. She kept the pressing combs in a drawer beneath the dish towels. There were two of them, both with wooden handles worn smooth from decades of use, the metal parts blackened from countless Sundays of heating and cooling and heating again. The combs had come from her mother, who had used them on her own daughters in a different house in a different time. And now they were being used on granddaughters who would one day understand what was being passed down in those quiet hours. The ritual began with washing. Hair was shampooed in the kitchen sink because the bathroom was too small and too cold, and because this was how it had always been done. The water ran warm, then hot, then warm again as grandmother worked shampoo through thick sections, her fingers strong and sure. There was no talking during this part. The only sounds were water running, the occasional instruction to tilt your head back or hold still, and the steady rhythm of her breathing as she worked. She used ivory soap sometimes, when money was particularly tight, but mostly it was the pink bottle of shampoo that lived under the sink and lasted for months because she knew exactly how much to use. After the washing came the waiting. Hair was towel dried, then sectioned and held with rubber bands that pulled tight enough to make your scalp ache if you moved wrong. The kitchen chair was positioned near the stove, close enough that you could feel the heat from the burners, but not so close that it was dangerous. Grandmother would test the comb against white tissue paper, watching for the right amount of brown to appear, the sign that the metal was hot enough to straighten, but not so hot it would burn. The first pass through a section of hair always smelled the strongest, that particular scent of heated hair and Vaseline and something else that had no name but meant transformation was happening. She worked in sections, moving from the nape of the neck upward, each pass of the comb pulling hair straight and leaving it gleaming. The heat was close to the scalp, close enough that you learned to sit perfectly still because moving could mean a burned ear or scalp. There were burns sometimes anyway, small marks on the edges of ears or the back of the neck that stung for days afterward. Nobody complained. This was the price of Sunday hair, of looking presentable, of honoring what was expected. Grandmother's hands never shook, never hesitated. She had done this too many times to count, for too many heads, in too many kitchens. Between sections, she would return the comb to the burner, testing it again with tissue, adjusting the flame if needed. The second comb stayed heating while she used the first, a rotation that kept the work moving without pause. Sometimes she would hum, old hymns mostly, the kind with words about crossing over or going home or resting in the arms of someone who understood. The humming was not for entertainment. It was the sound of concentration, of hands doing what they knew how to do while the mind wandered to other things. Sometimes she would pause, comb in hand, and stare at nothing for a moment before returning to the work. Those pauses meant she was thinking about people who were gone, or times that had passed, or worries that had no easy solutions. The transformation was gradual but absolute. What had been tightly coiled and resistant became smooth, straight, obedient. Each completed section was twisted and pinned to keep it from reverting before the whole head was finished. The process could take 2 hours, sometimes longer if there was a lot of hair or if it was particularly resistant. Time moved differently in that kitchen on Sunday mornings. The rest of the house still slept. The street outside was quiet except for the occasional car passing. The work continued in its own rhythm, measured not by clocks but by sections completed, by combs heated and cooled, by the gradual emergence of the person you were supposed to be when you walked into church later that morning. When it was finished, grandmother would step back and examine her work with critical eyes. She would adjust a section here, smooth down a piece there, her hands gentle now that the heat was gone. Then she would nod, a small gesture that meant approval, and you were allowed to look in the small mirror that hung by the kitchen door. The person looking back was familiar but different, hair lying flat and shining, edges neat and precise. This was the version of yourself that the world outside the house would see, the one that had been disciplined into acceptability through heat and skill and time. The pressing comb went back into its drawer, still warm. The kitchen would be cleaned, every trace of the ritual erased except for the lingering smell of hair and heat. By the time the rest of the house woke, the work was done, invisible in the way that so much of what women did was invisible. The only evidence was the straightened hair, the tidy kitchen, the sense that Sunday morning preparation had been accomplished, and now the day could proceed. There were rules about what happened next. You did not go outside and play. You did not roughhouse with siblings. You did not put your head down on anything that might mess up the work that had just been done. The hours between kitchen and church were a careful preservation of what had been created, a holding pattern until it was time to get dressed and walk out the door. Girls learned to move carefully, to keep their heads upright, to protect what grandmother had built with her hands and her combs and her patience. The church clothes hung in the closet, pressed and ready. These were not everyday clothes. They had been chosen carefully, purchased when money allowed, or sewn by hand when it did not. The dresses had been let out at the hems as girls grew taller, the seams let out and re-sewn so many times that the fabric was thin where the thread had been. The shoes were polished the night before, laces checked for fraying, heels examined for wear. Everything was meant to present a unified message. We take care. We try. We honor what is expected of us. Getting dressed required help. Zippers that ran up the back, buttons that were too small for child fingers, sashes that needed to be tied just right. Mothers and grandmothers moved through bedrooms, assisting and adjusting, their own preparation happening in fragments between helping others. They wore slips and stockings, girdles that made breathing slightly difficult, but ensured the proper silhouette. Their own hair had been pressed days before, then wrapped and pinned each night to preserve it. Their faces were made up with care, powder and lipstick applied in front of mirrors that had witnessed generations of Sunday morning transformations. The walk to church was a procession. Families emerged from houses up and down the block, all moving in the same direction, all dressed in their Sunday best. Women walked carefully in heels that were not meant for daily wear, their purses held just so, containing everything that might be needed: tissues, peppermints, the offering envelope, a small comb for emergency touch-ups. Men wore suits that had been dry cleaned and hung in closets all week, waiting for this moment. Children walked beside or slightly behind their parents, their patent leather shoes clicking on the sidewalk, their Sunday school lessons half remembered and soon to be tested. The church itself was a cornerstone of the neighborhood, brick and solid, with windows that let in colored light on sunny mornings. Inside, the air smelled like wood polish and old hymnals and the perfume of women who knew that Sunday required a different scent than the rest of the week. The sanctuary filled slowly, people greeting each other with nods and whispers, finding their usual spots, the pews they had sat in for years. There was an order to it, an unspoken geography that everyone understood. Families sat together, elders sat near the front, young people scattered themselves in the back and along the sides, hoping to avoid too much scrutiny from mothers who could see across the sanctuary with eyes in the backs of their heads. The service began with music. The organ wheezed to life, played by someone who had been playing it for longer than anyone could remember, their hands moving over keys worn smooth by decades of hymns. The choir filed in, robed and ready, taking their places in the loft behind the pulpit. They started singing, and the congregation rose to join them, voices blending in harmonies that had been learned not from sheet music, but from hearing them sung Sunday after Sunday for entire lifetimes. The old hymns, The ones about grace and mercy and burdens being lifted filled the space and seemed to hold everyone inside something larger than themselves. The preacher spoke in rhythms that built slowly, starting quiet and growing louder, his voice rising and falling in patterns that felt like breathing. He talked about trials and tribulations, about keeping faith when the world made it hard, about the promised land that was coming for those who endured. People responded, calling out agreement, nodding, sometimes standing when the Spirit moved them. The children sat still, or tried to, knowing that any misbehavior would be dealt with later in ways that did not require explanation. They unwrapped peppermints as quietly as possible, the paper crinkling despite their best efforts, the sugar dissolving slowly while the sermon continued. After church came the gathering, people lingering on the steps and the sidewalk, conversations continuing what had started inside. Plans were made for the week ahead. Information was shared about who was sick, who needed help, what was happening in the neighborhood. The church was not just a building for Sunday morning. It was the center of everything that mattered, the place where community was built and maintained and renewed each week. Children ran around the edges of these adult conversations, their Sunday clothes already beginning to show the wear of active bodies, their carefully pressed hair starting to lose its straightness in the humidity. The walk home was slower than the walk there had been. The effort of sitting still and being quiet and paying attention had left everyone a little tired. The afternoon stretched ahead, full of the particular quiet that Sunday afternoons held. There would be Sunday dinner, the biggest meal of the week, prepared while people were at church and waiting when they returned. The kitchen would fill with family, plates being passed, everyone eating until they were full, and then eating a little more because the food was there and because Sunday dinner was not something you rushed through. After eating came rest, not the kind of rest that involved activity or entertainment, but actual rest, the kind that meant lying down and closing your eyes while the house settled into afternoon quiet. Men loosened their ties and fell asleep in chairs, newspapers spread across their laps. Women changed out of their church clothes and into house dresses, their feet grateful to be out of heels. Children were sent outside or told to find something quiet to do, their Sunday clothes hung up carefully for another week, their play clothes put back on, the transformation reversed until it would be needed again. Evening came slowly. The day wound down in gradual increments, light fading from gold to amber to purple before darkness finally settled. Homework was finished at kitchen tables. Baths were taken, hair wrapped in scarves to protect what had been pressed that morning. The television might be on, showing whatever was available on the handful of channels that came through clearly. Families gathered around it, not really watching so much as being together in the same space, the glow of the screen providing something to look at while thoughts wandered. Bedtime arrived without announcement, children simply knowing when it was time to head upstairs or down the hall, to brush teeth and say prayers and climb into beds that held siblings more often than not. The house settled into nighttime sounds, the creaking of old wood, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of cars passing on streets that were quieter now than they had been during the day. Sleep came easy after Sundays, the kind of sleep that followed effort and ritual and the completion of what was expected. Monday would bring school and work and all the things that filled the week. But Sunday had been Sunday, set apart and different, marked by rituals that had been performed so many times they felt like breathing. The pressing comb would stay in its drawer until the following Saturday night. The church clothes would hang untouched in closets. Life would return to its weekday rhythms, faster and less careful, until the cycle began again. Years later, long after those Sunday mornings had ended, the smell of a pressing comb heating on the stove could bring it all back with a clarity that was almost physical. The feel of sitting in that kitchen chair, the sound of grandmother's humming, the particular quality of Sunday morning quiet. Time had moved forward, as it always did, carrying away the people and the places and the exact rituals. But the memory remained, precise and indelible, holding within it something about who you had been and what had been passed down and why it had mattered to sit perfectly still while heat and skill transformed you into the person you were supposed to be when you walked out the door. The children who sat in those kitchen chairs grew up and had their own children. Some continued the ritual, heating their own pressing combs in their own kitchens, passing down the skill and the expectation. Others let it go, finding different ways to manage hair and Sunday mornings and the question of presentation. But whether they continued it or not, they remembered. They remembered the smell and the waiting and the quiet concentration on grandmother's face as she worked. They remembered that it had been both burden and gift, both restriction and care, something that could not be understood fully while it was happening, but only later, when time had provided distance and perspective. The pressing comb itself might still be somewhere, in a drawer or a box, no longer used, but kept because throwing it away would feel like throwing away more than just an object. It would feel like discarding a piece of history, a tool that had been used to shape not just hair, but identity, not just appearance, but belonging. The comb had been practical, necessary, the only way to achieve what was expected in a time and place that had very specific ideas about how black girls should look when they walked into church on Sunday morning. But it had also been something else, something harder to name. It had been the medium through which care was expressed, through which generations were connected, through which the unspoken rules of survival and dignity were transmitted. Understanding came slowly, often years after the fact. What had felt like simple routine revealed itself to be layered with meaning that had not been visible at the time. The pressing comb had been about conformity, yes, but also about protection. Straightened hair opened certain doors, avoided certain scrutiny, made life slightly easier in a world that had very specific ideas about what was acceptable. Grandmother had known this in ways that children could not, had understood that the hour spent in the kitchen on Sunday morning was a kind of armor being carefully constructed, a way of moving through the world with slightly less friction. But it had also cost something. The heat had damaged hair over time, leaving it fragile and prone to breaking. The process had been painful sometimes, burns and tender scalps, the discomfort accepted as the price of transformation. And there had been the message, unspoken but clear, that what grew naturally from your head was not acceptable as it was, needed to be altered and disciplined and made to behave differently. That message settled into bones and minds, shaping how girls thought about themselves and their bodies and what was required of them. The complicated nature of it could not be reduced to simple condemnation or simple celebration. It had been what it was, a practice born of necessity and care, carried out with skill and intention, part of a larger system of survival that black families had developed over generations. The pressing comb had been one tool among many, each serving its purpose, each carrying weight that was both practical and symbolic. To reject it completely would be to reject the women who had wielded it, to dismiss their choices as mere capitulation. But to celebrate it without acknowledgement of what it had cost would be to miss half the truth. The Sunday mornings themselves had been beautiful in their way. The quiet, the ritual, the sense of preparation and care, the knowledge that you were being made ready for something important, that hands were working on your behalf, that time was being taken to ensure you looked right and proper and cared for. Those mornings had been acts of love, even when they had been uncomfortable, even when they had carried messages that were complicated. Grandmother had given what she had to give, had passed down what she knew how to pass down, had done her best with the tools and knowledge available to her. Time has a way of softening some edges while sharpening others. The discomfort of the heat fades in memory while the warmth of the kitchen remains. The pain of burns is forgotten while the smell of hair grease and coffee lingers. What persists is the image of hands working with care, of time being given, of silence that held concentration and love in equal measure. The memory becomes both specific and universal, particular to one kitchen and one grandmother, but also recognizable to anyone who experienced similar Sunday morning rituals in their own homes, their own neighborhoods, their own times. The world that required those Sunday morning preparations has changed in some ways and remains stubbornly the same in others. Natural hair is more accepted now in some spaces, less policed, less automatically read as unprofessional or unkempt. But the pressure to conform, to make oneself palatable, to smooth away anything that might cause friction or discomfort in others, that pressure persists in different forms. The tools have changed, but the fundamental calculation remains. How much of yourself can you afford to show, and how much must be carefully managed and controlled and disciplined before you walk out the door? The pressing comb sits in his drawer, or in his box, or wherever it ended up when it was finally retired from regular use. It is just an object now, metal and wood, no longer warm, no longer serving its original purpose. But it carries within it all those Sunday mornings, all those hours of careful work, all those generations of hands that held it and knew exactly how hot to make it and how to move it through hair without causing damage. It is a witness to something that happened over and over in kitchens across neighborhoods and cities and decades. And like all witnesses, it holds stories that cannot be fully told, only remembered and felt and passed down in fragments. The children who sat in those kitchen chairs are grown now, their own hair worn in ways that grandmother might or might not recognize, might or might not approve of. They make their own choices about Sunday mornings, about church, about how much effort to put into presentation and appearance. Some have daughters of their own, facing different pressures and different choices, but the same fundamental questions about how to move through a world that has very specific ideas about how they should look. The conversations about hair continue, changed but not ended, adapted but not resolved. What remains, beyond the debates and the choices and the changing standards, is the memory of being cared for, of someone taking time, taking care, using skill and patience to prepare you for what waited outside. That care was imperfect, complicated, sometimes painful, but it was real, and it mattered, and it shaped the people who received it in ways that continue to echo forward. The pressing comb was the tool, but the thing being transmitted was larger than any tool could contain. It was about surviving, about dignity, about passing down knowledge of how to move through the world as intact as possible. Sunday mornings are different now. The rituals have changed or disappeared entirely, but somewhere, in some kitchen, perhaps someone is still heating a pressing comb on a stove, still working carefully through sections of hair, still maintaining a tradition that stretches back through generations. And perhaps someone else is remembering, is catching a smell that triggers memory, is feeling again the particular quality of Sunday morning quiet and the warmth of a kitchen where transformation happened and care was expressed through heat and patience and hands that knew exactly what to do.